Emily Neff. Welcome back to the Soccer Queens podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
It has been a while, and for everyone listening, Emily has been on the show, gosh, I think 3 or 4 times before. We've
Mhm.
discussed periods, in-season training, nutrition, load management. Like, I'll probably just link every episode in the show notes, but we have done so many great conversations, and I'm really glad to have Emily back on today because we are going to talk about why it can be detrimental for athletes if they have too many cooks in the kitchen. They're hiring all the trainers, all the gurus, and they're not sticking to one path. Now, when I was growing up, I started strength and conditioning in the sixth grade, and I stayed with that strength coach until college. So it was like several years of my life, and it was absolutely incredible. And it was just nice to not be so confused with everything out there and to like really believe in a program. And I feel when you believe in a program, you really get results too. So let's just talk about why athletes shouldn't program hop and kind of bop around from trainer to trainer.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good place to start because my background is physiology. So I always like to take a physiological perspective and have our athletes and parents understand that when it comes to training, our job is to help the body adapt. And how do we do that? By exposing it to a type of training that needs to be progressively overloaded over time. We want to get stronger. Each week, do a little bit more weight. Every couple of weeks, do a similar movement pattern, but vary up that movement pattern that's going to allow us to progressively add more weight and then move that weight fast so we become more powerful. The problem if we program hop is that there's actually no direction to the program. So, an analogy I like to give to our families is that think that your athlete is has to run a mile. Are you going to run a mile in a circle? So you do all the work, but you end up in the same place that you started? That's an example of program hopping because you're doing a lot of work, but there's no direction to the stimulus that you're exposing your body to. And that means your body isn't actually going to improve, it's just going to kind of stay the same. Or you can run your mile from point A to point B. And this is what we want to do. This is because you're sticking to a program. Point B is the destination. So from point A, if you do similar training that's going to be progressively overloaded over time, that's how we know we're going to end up at point B. And that's at a better place than when you started.
Now, what about athletes who come into a strength and conditioning facility, but then their parents like, well, we have a separate sprinting mechanics coach or a gait analysis expert. Like, what do you say to that? Is that like way too confusing?
Yeah, that's such a good point. We definitely see that a lot where an athlete might have, their strength and conditioning coach, and then they obviously have their sport coach who's doing things, and then they may be at a running coach or doing their skills. And we have to remember that the body can only handle so much. So that's a lot of volume. And if each of these programs aren't working together, we're not going to see the same results that we could see if we communicated. So, this comes down to what's the game plan here. So, let's say we're talking about a soccer athlete and we're in winter and our goal is to prepare for spring season. If she is seeing a running coach who's having her do, you know, running an excessive amount of volume. When in the strength room, our job right now is to build some musculature in her lower body and core to get her to kick harder and run faster in the spring. We're doing too much volume. So that means that neither program is actually going to work to the same effect. Instead, we've increased her risk of injury. We're not going to put on as much muscle and strength as we could as if we coordinated and made sure that maybe that run coach who wants to build endurance is doing so more within repeated sprints because that is going to correspond a lot better with the high volume she's seeing in the strength room. So this really just comes down to communication. You know, I get it. We want to see a lot of people. We have big goals, but there's a difference between doing a lot of work and working very smartly. And working smartly just comes down to communication and making sure that we all know what the goal is. Everyone is here to help our athlete reach that goal. But if we don't have the same goal in mind, same effect. We're just going to keep running in circles versus in a straight line.
Oh, there are so many good things there. So the first thing is a fatigued athlete really can't make any progress. So that's just a really important point you made about just doing way too much load on the athlete. Now, another thing I see a lot of is a lot of kids will get confused on which trainer is right. And they will be getting different cues and advice on something like sprinting mechanics. And I've seen it before. I had a girl come to me and they're like, well, I worked with this like gait running expert and they told me this. And I'm like, well, you're with me now. So, like, we're going to go with what I'm saying because otherwise it's going to just confuse the heck out of you. So, have you been finding that as well? I think having too many cooks in the kitchen, athletes are like, well, who's right? Whose coaching cues do I listen to? Do I run this way? Do I run that way?
I was gonna say, when it comes to running, I see it often, especially if it's maybe someone. I was just working with an athlete the other day whose coach told her to kick her butt. But we don't necessarily wanna kick her butt, we wanna drive our knees forward when we're accelerating. So, I'm trying to help her, improve her mechanics when she's doing some of her conditioning work, but in her mind, what that coach said is what she should do. So I found that let the results speak for itself. So I had her run one, we timed it, and then I had her try to improve her mechanics where I said, now the goal is just lead with your knees, fall forward, drive your knees forward. And we hit a faster time. So that allowed her to kind of buy in more. I don't really know if there's a solution for that because there's always going to be people are gonna teach things in different ways, but when it comes to, like, what works the best, normally the results will speak for itself. So, I have found, if I have an athlete that's coming to us for strength training and maybe their school's doing strength training, but in school, it's a group-based training program versus here it's individualized, and maybe this athlete is being told that she should be squatting a certain way there and versus here, we're going to do things with, you know, more of an upright mechanics versus a hinge mechanics. So that again just comes to a conversation with the athlete of like, okay, well, here when we do our squats, I want us to lead with our knees forward and sitting our butt straight down because our squats are going to help us build more of our anterior strength and our hinges and deadlifts are going to build more of the posterior strength. The strength coach over there is just going to have you lead with more of a hips back because he's just trying to hit the backside of your body. There's no right or wrong, but there's just a different focus of what we're doing. So right here, I want you to focus on what I want you to feel, and I want you to feel your quads. So same thing, just kind of, I'm a big believer in not like downing what another coach said or like speaking poorly, but instead having that athlete know the why behind what you're doing because that allows them to buy into what you're doing more and it gives them that focus of what should I be feeling? Why am I doing this? And that often leads to better long-term retention and results for that athlete.
I think if athletes and parents do their research up front, they'll find a performance trainer who does offer all those things like the strength, the sprinting mechanics, working on the gait and the plyometrics. And that would just like really help so that they don't have to go to all these people. So that's one way to keep it simple. And
Yeah.
I think most athletes they need a performance coach, they might need a skills trainer and then maybe a nutritionist, but anything outside of that, you don't really need. There's just so much out there.
Exactly. Especially because you have a sport coach too, and you have to add that to the mix. So it's really, like you said, I mean, just from a scheduling standpoint, I don't know how these parents are taking these athletes to all these different specialists, especially when these athletes are normally adolescents and adolescents are 17 and younger. So during that period, you really just need to focus on the big blocks, and that's getting your athlete stronger, more powerful, building her endurance, and having her play her sport. So with that, yeah, maybe nutrition also should be added in because she doesn't even know what a protein, carb, and fat is. That leaves you with three people: your sport coach, your strength and conditioning coach, and a nutritionist or some type of like, educator in that realm.
and maybe if you need, like, mental training, but other than that, you don't need all these, like, very, like, specialized gurus
Mm,
because you
no,
just go down a rabbit hole and it's like, "Oh my gosh, this is, like, way too much." Like, let's keep it simple. Now,
exactly.
as far as, like, the managing load with skills trainers, because most athletes who do performance training do work with a skills trainer pretty much year round as well, whether for better or for worse. But in the past, I've run into issues with, the skills trainer not communicating the load, and then I have to tell the athlete, "Hey, like, in this skill session tomorrow, like, you need to be at, like, a really low workload because we just ran 10 tempo runs today." But then
Mm,
you, like, look at, like, what actually happened on the GPS, and I'm like, "Oh, wow, they definitely didn't listen." And their workload was, like, through the roof, and I'm like,
yep.
"Okay," like, sometimes we can try to communicate, but it
Mm,
can be hard because everyone will still do what they want.
so hard. And especially from a, young athlete perspective, she doesn't get that she needs to have down days because that's actually gonna help her improve. In their mind, it's that work hard mentality. I just have to keep pushing myself where it's like, yeah, but like, no, there needs to be, like, you have to be responsible and you actually have to be disciplined knowing when there's a time to pull back. But with that, I've just kind of found that, we can only control what we can control, and that's our volume and what we do. So with our program, what we do is we ask the parents to just give us an estimated hours per week that they're doing separate, skills based and sport based. And that's going to allow us to estimate how much volume we can actually expose to them. So let's say this athlete is doing 5 to 10 hours of sport and 5 to 10 hours of skill. It could be in upwards of 20 hours per week, and they're coming to us 2 times per week. But we know during this period, it should be more of a volume hypertrophy phase. We know that how are we going to expose this athlete to volume? It's not going to be necessarily through high reps, but instead, let's add density. Let's get more sets in. And that way we can balance, still hit our goal without telling the athlete she can't do this, she can't do that. And now the sport coach doesn't like me because I said this one thing and they said something else. So instead, it's like, let us control the variables that we can control within reason and still reach our goals, knowing like, hey, I know you're doing 20 hours per week. So during our deload week, we're deloading hard. We are dropping everything to 2 sets. We are dropping reps. We're dropping intensity because that way I know, at least within my end, I'm helping this athlete recover and adapt and within what I can control.
This has been a really important discussion for improved sport performance, but also injury reduction and committing and picking a path and finding a great performance coach and sticking with it. And how many months would you say to really start seeing some drastic results when they start a program?
I mean, with our athletes, we actually test them every 2 months. Every 2 months, we test their 20-yard sprint and their vertical. So the first year, they're going to see improvements about every 2 months. After about a year, really now we're using those tests to monitor fatigue. And we expect to see improvements about every 4 to 6 months. But seeing, as long as our athletes are staying within 5% of what their initial metrics were, we know that we're managing fatigue very well. And we communicate this with the family. But if we're seeing a huge drop off in vertical or huge drop off in their sprint speed, this allows us to know like, one, has she been consistent with the program? Because if not, this is what happens with your power and sprint and your speed. Or are you just doing too much? Well, now I have data to demonstrate for you. Like, yes, you've been consistent here, but you're doing so much extra work. It's actually negatively impacting the characteristics that are going to help you be better at your sport. So, what does your recovery look like? Do you have a rest day? It allows us to kind of use the same metrics, but have a different conversation.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I usually say like 2 to 3 months and but sadly like people give up before then. They're like, "Oh, this program's not giving me what I want." And it's like, "No, you need to stick with it. You need to commit. You need to pick something and you can't just be this like flake like bopping around everywhere." And I think this applies to just real life in general. So, not just sport performance, but when these girls are done playing, I mean, this same message of consistency, long-term consistency applies to school, career, building relationships. So let's get into that and then just wrap this up.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a a great way of looking at it because what is sport? Sport is a vehicle to teach these athletes something as it relates to adulthood. So I think the consistency thing is huge. So as an owner, when I'm interviewing people, the first thing I look at is how long have you stayed at your past jobs? Because if I see that you've had multiple jobs within the past 3 years, that demonstrates to me that you lack commitment. And that's a big red flag. That's not something that we want here. We want someone that's committed because for the same reason, I can't develop a coach and have you develop our program together as a team if you lack commitment. So, same concept, if you're unable to, stay dedicated to a training program, what is that going to reflect as you reach your adult career? Just when things get tough, you step down. Instead, it's like, well, have you had conversations? When I just see job hopping, that tells me someone isn't able to communicate well, they leave when things get tough, or they don't understand how to have difficult conversations, and instead they just probably want something easy, and that's just not the right fit for us here.
Oh, that's such a good point, and I see that often in our industry especially. There's a lot of turnover every year or 2 with strength coaches, and that's no way to professionally grow and eventually maybe get the salary you want or the projects you want, so that is so good, and what comes to mind also is even just what colleges are looking for in admissions, and I, read this book, I forget who wrote it, but it was what Ivy League schools look for in applicants, and they said that it's not necessarily how many extracurriculars you do, like being involved in like 10 different things. It's about being really good at like 1 to 2 things and standing out as an applicant. And maybe you're like a math whiz or you're like first chair clarinet in the band. Like being good at like one thing and just mastering that like really stands out. And that takes commitment too.
Commitment, yeah, what differentiates you?
Exactly. Well, this has been awesome, Emily. I know a lot of people are really excited for this topic because this is like so rampant nowadays. So I hope everyone learned something new and feel free to comment any questions or any experiences you might have. And I'll leave Emily's social media links in the caption below. And we will see you on the next episode.